Hi, this is Joel from Joel and Light Photography, and I thought I'd do something a little different and fun, not related to wedding photography. So I'm on contract to do some photographs for the City of HorrorCon website, and so every once in a while when I'm out shooting one of those assignments, I'll just stop and do some bonus shots. I was initially kind of trying to photograph this little bench and arbor area here. Just kind of get some morning light on it. So this is where I started, and I just really love the flowers, so I started playing around with different ways to kind of feature the scene, highlight the flowers, but also showcase the little bit of architecture there. Keeping in mind that these may be used on a website, so trying to do everything horizontally to fit that screen dimension. And then I started playing around with, what I could do shooting up from underneath the flowers, kind of getting a backlight scenario with the sky as the background. So I liked a lot of the shots I was getting, and I started to kind of just dip the camera down into the flowers, so I wasn't really looking through the viewfinder. I didn't feel like getting full of dirt and bugs and stuff, so I just kind of stuck the camera in there, pointed it up. I had set the focus to manual. The focal length was 24 millimeter. On the 24-120 f4 VR lens from Nikon, and the focus was also set to the nearest point, so that was all manual. And of course exposure was manual. I was using the Sunny 16 rule, so if you look up here, I'm at ISO 100, aperture f16, and 1/100th of a second, so that gives you a perfect Sunny 16 exposure, and that exposure is perfect whenever the sun is out fully. And you can see, if you look at the histogram, where toward the right you have the number of pixels in the highlight area, and then on the left the number of pixels in the shadow area. So this is your contrast from pure black to pure white. So just a raw import from the camera, you can see that using Sunny 16, even pointed up at the sky, as long as the sun isn't in the picture, you've still got perfect dynamic range, with the pixels moving right up to the edge of pure white, but not quite, so there's still detail in all these clouds. And then of course the shadows still have detail. There might be just a little bit of clipping in some of the areas, but to me that's really nothing, not worth noticing. Nobody's going to notice that really in the final print. So Sunny 16, perfect exposure, start with that. This is one of the final images, one of the finished images that's edited. So I want to show you how I got there from this negative. Okay, so starting with the Sunny 16, it's a little underexposed for me because, as you can see, the clouds started getting in front of the sun. So as soon as that happens, Sunny 16 is no longer going to get you the perfect exposure, because that's for full sun. So you would open up, about a stop here. I didn't do that, but with the Nikon D4 and the 14-bit RAW files, it's really not that much of an issue. Actually, I would say it's not really an issue at all to bump up that exposure. So start with a good exposure. And most of these, like I said, using Sunny 16 were spot on. If I go to reset all the settings, you know, all the details there. So starting with this, the first thing I do is I create custom camera profiles using the color checker passport. So what you do is you photograph this target, and I'll see if I can get a shot of it here. So you photograph this target in the same light that you're going to take the picture in. In other words, the same light source. It doesn't have to be the same brightness, but the same source. So in this case, full sun. So you set the target in that light, you get a perfect exposure of it, and then you run a little plugin in Lightroom, so it basically converts the camera raw to correct color using this chart as a reference. So you create a custom profile that way for a light source. So in this case, it's daylight and it's the Nikon D4. So I select that profile, and you can see some subtle shifts in the color. They'll become more apparent later as we do some more editing. But here's the standard. I'll give you a little zoom in here. And then here's the daylight. So just some very subtle shifts, but they do make a difference. So I shot on daylight white balance, and I just want to warm that up just a little bit. So next thing is exposure, and I'm going to bump that up, but I don't want to start losing highlight detail, so I watch my highlight clipping up here. And I think right about there is good. You know, exposure is somewhat subjective. I'm going to bump up a little contrast. Then I'm going to take my white slider. I'm going to hold the alternate key. I'm going to slide the whites until I start seeing some clipping. So right about there. Maybe back it off a little bit. I'm going to bring the black levels up until I see this arrow start to disappear, because that tells me some of the black detail is being lost, some of the shadow detail. I'm going to bump that up until that arrow changes. That means I'm getting a little bit more detail in the black. If it's solid white, that means there's some pure clipping there. So I'm going to bump it up until I see a little bit of color in that arrow. Alright. Clarity is kind of a localized contrast. It kind of gives you the impression of detail. So I'm going to go ahead and bump that and just watch as the image changes. And just kind of eye up the level that I want. Okay, so I usually don't go too crazy, but I'll show you what it looks like if you go all the way. You get a lot of local contrast. So I'm going to go about 20. The vibrance I can play with significantly, because this is kind of there's a lot of primary colors here, and that's what vibrance is good with. It's good with blues and greens especially. So you can see as I increase it, those blues and yellows really get amped up. Of course, I don't want to go that far. I think I want to go about 30-ish. I'm going to leave saturation alone, because once you do the custom camera profile, you really don't need it that much, and you can see saturation very quickly gets to be too much. So I just leave that alone. So those are my basic adjustments, and if I do a before and after, so from here to here is where we've gone so far with just the color profile and basic camera adjustments. Next thing I'm going to do is go right to detail. I'm going to bump up to the detail settings to basically what I use for any image with this ISO. I'm going to basically use the same settings and then fine tune if I need to. So I go with sharpening 75 on the amount, 0.8 on the radius, 15 on the level of detail, 40 on the level of masking. So interestingly, what masking does is it tells the software what areas to apply the sharpening and what areas to not sharpen. So everything in black is actually going to be not sharpened, and that's a good thing, because if you look, that's where the plain sky is, and if you have an area without detail, you don't want to apply any sharpening there, because it's just going to bring out noise and graininess in the image that you don't need. So by applying the masking, we can see that that area is now actually not going to be sharpened. I can probably even go a little more. So the higher you go with the mask, the less is sharpened, and the lower you go, the more is sharpened. So anything that's white gets the sharpening. So that's why my default is right at about 40. I'm going to go a little more with this. And since I did bump up the exposure by more than a stop, I'm going to go ahead and apply some noise reduction, which is the luminance, and try to tune some of that out. So just kind of a before and after on the detail. It might be hard to see with the video resolution, but there's a nice subtle change with the amount of sharpness. Next thing I do is lens corrections. Now you might overlook this, but and you may not think it's necessary. It's a subjective thing, but what it does is, if you turn it on, the software finds your lens and then applies some corrections for lens distortion and vignetting, and it does that automatically. So if you just click Enable Profile Corrections, you'll see there's a little distortion that gets corrected, and you can kind of see, if you do it back and forth, you can kind of see the roundness of the lens coming into play. Kind of see how that the image gets distorted just from the lens itself. So in most cases I like to correct that because it just to me it looks a little more true to life. You see some of the lines get straightened out a bit, they get pulled straight, and then there's less vignetting around the edges, which is not always desirable, but in this case I think it works. So if you watch the corners, you'll see some of the image just gets pulled out of the frame. So you have to keep that in mind, but I'm okay with that. A chromatic aberration is when you start getting color fringes around the edges of objects that are in bright light, and I don't see any of that. I usually just turn it on. So if you zoom in and you see purple or green fringes around objects, that's when you want to turn this on, and then change the amount until you see those fringes go away. Okay, so that's the basic edit of the image. So you see this is where we started, and this is where we are right now. So I'll give you a little before and after. Okay, so nice deep blue sky, and I didn't use any polarizer, and you notice I've got nice detail in the clean whites and nice detail in all the shadow areas. So a nicely balanced image, and I'll show you what it looks like with, if you would have used just the regular camera profile, this Adobe standard. So again, this is the software's way of interpreting the color in the raw file, because a raw file is not processed in the camera. The raw file records only the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO, and that's it. So it doesn't apply any contrast or sharpness or anything like that. But the advantage of the RAW file is that it contains a lot more detail than a JPEG, detail that you can play with, which in this case is good because the image was underexposed by more than a stop. With a JPEG, if you would have had to bring out one stop worth of detail, you would have had some serious artifact problems and noise problems. So again, here's what it would look like with no camera color profile, no color checker, just going with the software defaults. To me, it gets a little bit too red, and if you go to the custom profile, it's a lot more natural. You can see it's kind of gets a little bit more magenta into the whites and the yellows, and you even start to see the just a tinge of purple coming in. And with the custom profile, it's a lot more color accurate. The flowers are yellow, they're not orange. The greens, everything just kind of falls into place with that custom camera profile. So it's a good image right there. To take it a step further, I'm going to open it into Nik Color Effects Pro. So this is the Lightroom file, and this is the finished file after Nik Color Effects. So again, Lightroom file, and then Color Effects. So what I did was just a little bit of software polarization, some dynamic contrast, some brilliance and warmth, but that's pretty much it. Now to make this ready for the web or print or wherever, I simply go to export. So I'm going to export to the same folder in the original as the original picture, but I'm going to put it in a subfolder called gallery, so I know that it's a finished picture that's ready to showcase. I don't change the file name because I rename all the pictures as they're imported. So it's got the date, the assignment, and then a sequential file number. The file settings, if it's going into something that might be printed, or if it's for a paid job, or just really any image that I want to be high quality, I leave the quality at 90. It doesn't need to be at 100. It's a little bit overkill. The format is JPEG. The color space is always, for me, going to be sRGB. I don't use any of the others because the lab pretty much always wants the file to be in sRGB color space. Resolution, always 300. I want to get the max resolution out of the file. I don't apply any sharpening because that's been done already. I want to include all the metadata, which has my name and contact information attached. And we'll click export. Lightroom will render the file. And that's it. It's ready to be shared and uploaded. So just to show you a couple of other images, a couple of favorites from the shoot. This one for sure is pretty cool. I've edited. I've done the basic editing. So I'll show you the before and after with this so far. So you can see again, starting with perfect exposure and just enhancing the file. So again, this is Joel from Joel and This Site Photography. Thanks for watching.